click record. And hello, everyone. Welcome to our UU Virtual Roundtable. My name is Sarah Reyes, and I will be today's moderator. So before we begin, I want to just take the time to remind everybody that we are recording these sessions, and we will be uploading them onto the UUCLC YouTube page. So we upload a lot of good stuff on there. We upload the Roundtable, virtual worship service, some of the sermons. So it's just a really good resource if you ever want to go back and rewatch some of the content that the UUCLC produces. Secondly, we ask that you remain muted during the presentation section. And this is just so we can get through everything pretty quickly. And afterwards, we will have a Q&A section afterwards. And that will be all. So please enjoy today's roundtable session.
Okay, I'm going to just shortly introduce Don. I think many of you know him, but he gave me a short bio, and he's got quite a background, chemistry, and he's got a MS and PhD in astronomy. Spent a number of years, I didn't know this, up at the National Solar Observatory, where he's part of a scientist group up there, and was with the Air Force for a period of time as a taught in both physics, mathematics, and astronomy. And then all of a sudden he got interested in economics. I'm kind of curious, going from hard science to soft science. But anyway, we're looking forward to your talk today, Don.
Okay. All right, should I start?
Yep, please.
And how's the sound? Is the sound coming through all right?
Yeah, you sound fine.
Good.
All right. Okay, anytime you want to put up the first slide. Okay, well, there's the title. And two things I should tell you. First of all, the title isn't quite right in terms of the emphasis I'm putting. So let's look at the second slide. There. Not totally crossing out the first part of it, but the emphasis is on the rise of inequality. And let's see, the second thing I want to tell you is that I don't have a very good understanding of what I'm talking about. So I'll be easy pickings for the people who criticize. Economics is not my background, but I was very intrigued by a couple of things that came to my attention. Let's look at the third slide. All right, there is a backdrop that we're talking about that we need to throw up here first. So let's look at the next slide. I hope you can see it. There's some of the fine print. There's a lot on one graph. These are some fundamental indicators of the US economy over the last 60 years, so 80 years. And this is all federal at the federal level, and everything you see here is going to be expressed as a percent of GDP. And the top line shows the federal debt, which has this interesting U shape to it, more or less. You'll notice that it bottoms out somewhere around the middle, roughly around 1980. And the next two lines in red and green show how the spending has been slowly increasing as a fraction of GDP, while at the same time revenue has been declining. So it's not too surprising that the shape of the debt above is what it is. Now let's go down and then skip the GDP growth for a minute and you look down to the federal healthcare spending. And there's the real gorilla in the room, starting about 1965, coincides with Medicare. The federal spending on healthcare has gone up enormously. It's about 6% of GDP now, and that's only 1/3 of what the country as a whole spends on it. It's a real killer. The bottom line is something that most people never see, and that is the decline in federal discretionary spending as a function of GDP. And the reason that's important is because most of the seed corn activities in this country, meaning federal spending on education, research and development, and infrastructure are being squeezed out. And that may have something to do with what's happening on the graph up above there with the blue line that shows how the GDP growth rate has been declining ever since the 1950s. Long-term decline. All right, let's go to the next slide. And that pretty much summarizes everything that you've seen there. And a lot of these changes that you see are clustered around 1980, more or less. And I'm just summarizing them again here. And one other one that I didn't mention yet that also started in 1980 was this rapid rise in inequality in wealth and income in the United States. And it is truly amazing. Another thing that I didn't mention is the change in public attitude. I guess I'm old enough to say this. I think this started roughly in this same time period, that there's been a rising anti-government, anti-tax sentiment that's gone on. And I think all of these factors sort of play together and they paint a very bad picture, and it's quite distressing. I call this transformation shameful because it went unchallenged by an unwatchful public. And what can I say? I see people, a large fraction of the population, standing by the sidelines cheering this change on with anti-government sentiment. And all the while they're shooting themselves in the foot, I would say. So, come on, Americans, don't you get it? All right, let's look at the next slide. And this is where the meat of it comes. Now, this is going to be a venture into theoretical economics, and I suspect this is something that most people haven't heard of, and I hadn't heard of it either until a year or two ago. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide, okay. There we go. All right, this is a plot of the income share of the top 10% of Americans. The red is, the blue is just plain old income, and the red is income plus capital gains income. And what you see is like 45% back in the 1920s, 45% of the wealth in the upper 10%. And then came the crash, the big drop. And the crash did not change the inequality. If you look on the graph, you'll see that during the Great Depression, everybody got hurt, but the relative share of the income in the economy still went to mostly to the people in the top 10%. And then in the 1930s, that dropped with the new policies that were put into place. And then World War II started, and that dropped it further. And then there was a GI Bill and many other changes in regulations that formed a structural base for a reduced level of inequality. And it lasted for 40 years, even after the war and through the post-war economic boom. And then in 1980, look at that, and up it goes. And it stops, the graph stops at 2007, but it's much worse now than it was in 2007. All right, next slide. And here is what we have now. It is just unbelievable. This is a percentile distribution of household wealth in the United States in 2016. And you can see there that half of the population, the half below the median, has 1% of the total wealth in the country, and the half above the median has 99%. It's just incredible. Next slide. So what we're going to do here is take a new look at inequality. This is a new way of understanding what's going on at a deeper, perhaps you would call theoretical level. And what we're going to be talking about are agent-based affine models of wealth distributions in free market economies, not just the United States. Don't worry about the word affine. It's a category of mathematical models. You don't need to know anything about that right now. And how this came about was really interesting. It draws upon some similarities that have been seen between inequality and asymmetries in physical systems. And the people that saw this were not economists. They were physicists and mathematicians. And they got into this and they developed these agent-based models. And these models have been able to describe the wealth distribution in free market economies with an unbelievable level of precision. One of the persons involved here, his pictures at the bottom, is Bruce Bughosian at Tufts University. And I like this comment he made after he did some of his work, that the economy that we live in is a casino that you can never leave. And you'll see how that works out. Anyway, we're going to see some underlying forces that concentrate wealth into the hands of a few. Next slide. Now we're going to do an example. We're going to have a little fun here. This is a game, and it's not a full picture of what these models have, but if you understand this little game, I think you'll see what's happening right away. We're going to imagine a number of agents, and these are individuals or they can be whole companies. And we're going to let each agent start off with $1 and engage in 10 transactions with other agents, where the outcome of each transaction is going to be decided by a coin flip. Our heads will give you a 20% gain, and tails will give you a 17% loss. Now, the subtlety here, and everybody's a sucker to this, I don't care how smart you are, this sounds like a good gamble, because the odds of winning and losing are equal. It's a fair coin. And it looks like a tempting thing to do because the gain would be larger in dollars than the loss. Game is perfectly fair, but now just watch what happens after it goes on for a while. Next slide. Now this is the binomial distribution. It's a statistical property of discrete probabilistic outcomes. And I'm showing you here the statistics for 10 coin flips. And there are 11 outcomes, 0 through 10. And the most common outcome, as everyone knows, will be 5 heads. And 24.6% of the time, people will get 24.6% of a situation where the outcome is 5 heads. And to either side, it declines rapidly, so that by the time you get down to 0 heads or 10 heads, that happens only 0.1% of the time. I can't quite see the bottom of the graph. I hope you can. Let's see.
Yeah, I think we can.
Okay, great. I just collapsed my screen here. Okay, all right. So here's what the players get after 10 flips, and that's on the very bottom line. The guy on the left at 0 heads gets 16 cents. The guy who flips 5 heads gets 98 cents. And the one that flips 10 heads gets $6.19. That's pretty amazing. The number of heads is a linear scale from left to right, but you'll notice the dollars that ends up going to the various players is not linear at all. It starts out slowly increasing and then shoots way up over toward the right. Next slide. Now, what I'm going to do here is perform an inversion on this graph to turn it into something that we'll recognize. I'm going to put the dollar outcomes on the vertical scale. And I'm going to put the number of agents that receive the various outcomes on a linear horizontal scale. I'm going to express that in percentiles. Okay, next slide. Oh my, there it is. Now, does that look familiar, even after only 10 coin flips? And you see what's happening. There's this rapid shoot up over on the right. And then over on the extreme left, there's a roll off just at the very end. Now, if you go back to the previous slide, Actually, no, I'm sorry, go back to the next slide. The next slide, that's the one that follows the graph. There we go, right there. Okay, just to remind you what this looks like. Now the graph with the coin flips I showed you, everything's a little higher. Nobody is coming up with negative net wealth, as in reality they do. And the only reason for that is the simplified game I gave you allows no provision for borrowing money and going into debt. And if it did, the previous graph with the coin flips would show people in the hole, as this graph does for the people down near that bottom 5% of people actually owe more than they own. All right, let's go on. Next slide. Now already we're going to learn something here. What even this simplified model shows you that these agent-based models demonstrate that inequality is a natural tendency in a free market economy. And that's even when all agents begin with equal assets and they have equal abilities. So you can imagine what it'd be like if they don't have equal abilities and if the wealthy ones. That's kind of a surprising thing. You'll note that the inequality that comes out of this is an emergent property of the model. It does not result from anything that was put into it. Maybe I should stop here and ask if anybody has a question, just quickly.
Well, I just wanted, Don, when you had that slide earlier in regard to discretionary military funds, the military is the only one that's really increased. It's now 60% of the discretionary funds. And so there's not much left for other needs of our society.
Yeah, it's a big chunk of the discretionary funds, but as a fraction of the whole GDP, military spending is down.
Oh, I know, but I'm discretionary. I'm just talking about, and that's where as you indicated, that's where new programs are started to help people out, but they have really declined.
Yes, indeed. All right, let's go on to a little diversion here. I'm going to show you something that does not work in terms of trying to figure out why wealth is concentrated at the top. Now, what I'm showing you here is a comparison between the binomial distribution, that's the one with the dots on it. You saw that before. And the red one is a normal distribution, normal statistical distribution, which is sometimes called a Gaussian, or some people call it a bell curve. The shapes are similar, but the thing to bear in mind is that whether you're talking about the number of heads or some other trait that you're using to describe a normal distribution, they are linear on the bottom scale. All right, let's go to the next slide. Now, you've probably run into the normal distribution somewhere else in your travels. It's used to describe a lot of human traits like heights and shoe sizes, and IQ is well known. I don't know if anybody's ever made an attempt to put ability as a normal distribution. It's probably very hard to assess ability. And what is ability anyway, particularly when it comes to making money? Well, it's probably the combination of a number of factors like IQ, certainly motivation, talent, preparation, creativity. And there's another one in there that we dare not forget, is willingness to be dishonest. That helps a lot until you get caught. So the question that loomed before us is, just as a hypothetical question, is might ability and wealth follow a normal distribution? And would that explain the wealth distribution in the United States? And of course, you all know already that wealth in the United States does not follow a normal distribution. But if it did, let's see how it would translate. Next slide. So suppose wealth followed a normal distribution as shown on the left there. if I perform the same inversion on this curve that I did with the coin flipping curve, I get the thing on the right there. And it's a funny looking thing. 40% of the wealth below the median, 60% of the wealth above the median. And you can immediately see it does not follow anything like the graph right below it, which is the actual. So there's something else going on here, and our agent-based models have something to say about that. So let's look at the next slide. One of the things that comes out of these agent-based models is that the observed wealth distribution is primarily originating from asymmetries in the transactions that agents make in free market economies. And we saw a very simplified example of that with the coin flip. What was so tempting to us, what looked like a fair deal, isn't fair at all if you keep doing it. You always end up with a loser on one side and big winners on the other. So it's the transactions that are and the way transactions are conducted that are producing most of this unbelievable skew in the wealth distribution, according to these models. And how well do they work? Well, it's absolutely amazing. These models can match the wealth distribution to about 99.7% in the United States and in other countries as well, as long as there's economic data available for analysis. Now, right off the bat, we should say that every country is different. And so how can you use the same model to explain high accuracy in matching wealth distributions? And the answer to that is that the agent-based models do this with the aid of two parameters that can be adjusted in order to obtain an empirical fit to the wealth distributions in any country where there are data available in free market systems. Now, one of these parameters is a wealth bias parameter that actually enhances the tendency for wealth to trickle up to people who are already wealthier. And then there's another parameter that works in opposition to that one, and that's a redistribution parameter. And it moves wealth from the wealthier agents to the poorer agents. All right, let's go to the next slide. The wealth bias parameter lumps together everything that gives advantages to people that are on the right-hand side of the wealth curve. And you're familiar with these, of course. There are tax structures that favor wealthy agents, things that you can do that the little guy can't, corporate practices, and then there are self-generating advantages that amplify opportunity. And these come out of the free market system. Insider trading, for example, happens all the time. It's just not very often that people get caught. You can negotiate better loans when you're wealthy. You can have tax and financial experts to take advantage of things that the little guy can't. And you can also have access to elected officials, and you can influence them in your favor. So all that gets lumped under this one parameter, which is designated here by the symbol zeta. And then there's the redistribution parameter. It lumps together all of the means of downward transfer of wealth. And these exist in all democratic nations to one degree or another. For example, in the United States, we have all of the social insurance mechanisms of Social Security, Medicare, there's minimum wage, there are unions, there's welfare, unemployment benefits, and public education, of course, is really a big one. All right, so we have these two adjusting parameters, one that enhances the wealth to shift toward the wealthy, and one that pulls it back in the other direction. Okay, next slide. And here's where some of the countries come out. This is a plot of the a dozen or more nations, and every one of these nations has been fitted to great accuracy with the models and the two parameters, the wealth-based parameter and the redistribution parameter, that have been required in order to make those fits accurate are shown on this plot. So for example, over in the lower left-hand corner, there are a few countries there that don't have very great, don't require very large adjustments in the wealth bias parameter in order to get the solution. But at the same time, they don't need much in the way of a redistribution parameter either. And that's just the opposite up in the upper right-hand corner, where the wealth distribution parameters are quite high, but the redistribution parameters are also very high. And I'm showing you here a line that runs down the diagonal that kind of divides these two regimes. And I should throw in a definition of oligarchy here as we speak. It's a condition where a very few persons hold most of the wealth of a country. So in the blue wedge is a regime of no oligarchy. And in the upper pink band, there's a regime of partial oligarchy. And most of the nations that have been analyzed sort of run close to the diagonal up the middle there. Next slide. Okay, now I haven't said anything about inequality. The countries that are in the blue wedge, and there's only one here that's shown that is solidly in the blue wedge, that doesn't mean there is no inequality there. And the chart really doesn't plot inequality, but in a general sense, if you wanted to know the sense of direction of inequality, it goes from the blue wedge up through the pink wedge, sort of perpendicular to the line. And you'll see that most of the nations there are actually slightly into the partial oligarchy regime. And that's an interesting fact that they cluster so close to the line. It suggests that political pressures have been acting to pull them back toward the line, which is an encouraging fact, by the way. Another thing that we should note about this is that if any country drifts for one reason or another from the blue wedge, it crosses the line into the pink wedge, and once it gets there, if you take your hands off the wheel, then there's nothing to stop it from shooting up further into the pink zone. And so in other words, to stop that, these models are telling us that you have to apply a larger pressure toward redistribution or to reduce the wealth bias parameter. All right, let's go to the next slide. Now you may want to wonder if these agent-based models are really representative of actual economies. And there are some criticisms that are probably going to pop up right away. The first part, you could certainly argue that they don't represent the real world because they don't include specific economic instruments. They just have these two generalized parameters. So these agent-based models are purely empirical, and the counter argument to them is that they're actually made to fit the data on inequality, and that's true. And so what we're saying here as a response is these models are indeed empirical. They're descriptive rather than predictive. They don't have any means, for example, of saying that if I increase taxes on the wealthy, where would that put how would that redistribute wealth? They don't predict that. These models are, in that sense, abstractions, but they do demonstrate plausible asymmetries that are associated with negotiations and trade. And they also include the often neglected role of luck in the real world. So in a sense, their biggest value perhaps is helping us understand how asymmetries in transactions generate the skew in wealth distributions. Next slide. Then there's some takeaways here. The first one is that there's a natural tendency in a free market economy, and that is for wealth to trickle up, not down. And the lesson here, that historians have probably noticed this for a long time, and maybe economists have noticed it too, that active intervention must constantly be applied in order to prevent wealth from drifting to the top. If you don't do anything, it's going to happen and it'll get out of control and you'll have an oligarchy. And as we have seen, fortunately, democratic nations have prevented that from happening. The second point is that agent-based models demonstrate that inequality is not an inevitable fate in a free market economy. It's a matter of choice. And here again, I have to blame the American public in our case, that they're just not watching the store of what's going on. Thirdly, agent-based models provide new methods for measuring and comparing inequality between nations, as well as how they evolve in time. So there's some new parameters to look at that are very useful. And fourth, agent-based models sort of take the wind out of a lot of arguments about equality being a deserved condition in which the accumulation of wealth at the top is purely a matter of merit. And they suggest that it is not, that luck still plays a big role in what falls out of the wealth distribution. And that's something that wealthy people probably aren't willing to admit. All right, the next slide. And there we go. Well, thank you. If you would like a copy of this, there's where you can get it.
I would love one, Don, please. This is an interesting, coming at it from a very analytical point of view. I've come at this in a different way, but this is interesting.
Okay, thank you.
So any questions, comments, please?
Boy, you sure raised enough questions here. Is there any, what you've presented, is there any, what am I trying to say, a movement in this direction? And has somebody published anything that you could really look into more detail as to the implications?
Yeah, actually, a fair amount of work has been done in this area. And I no longer have library privileges where I can get things online. And I'm not an economist anyway, so I can't go beyond what you would call secondary sources. And there's only one that I know of that I could give you that forms a lot of what's been said here, and it's an article in Scientific American. It's in 2019 in November, and it's written by the gentleman whose picture I showed in the slides here. Now, he doesn't include everything that I've told you because I've worked out some of this stuff myself, but that's a good place to start. And I don't think you're probably, most of us are not in a position to look at anything further. But there is a lot of work going on, and there are a number of people doing this. I don't know how this is being taken by traditional economists.
Yeah,
I would
OECD,
imagine not well.
I worked at OECD in Europe for a while. They have done some work on this, Organization of Economic Developed Countries. And they have done some work on this. But I wasn't aware of the total analytical aspect of it until you made the presentation.
Yeah.
But OECD, I know, has some publications.
Yeah. Well, I see my role here and just being able to communicate this as a new idea that's out there. And my sense of it is that it might be gaining steam, but it certainly hasn't taken over the field by any means.
No,
So,
not at all.
So
I have a
Go
question.
ahead, Dave Steele.
Yeah, I have to admit that I don't think I followed every nuance of your presentation, and that's bad on me and not on you. But I'm just wondering, what are the policy implications of this model for for reducing the health or the wealth inequalities that are so pervasive right now?
Well, I think if the average American citizen saw what was going on and saw how inequality is adjustable by those two generalized parameters and where he fits in that wealth distribution that I showed you, I would say that any smart politician could say, hey, look, people, what's going on here? We can stop this. The United States didn't used to be this way. I mean, there was always inequality naturally, but it's getting worse. And why are people standing on the sidelines, not doing anything about it? And you can easily see how it's developing with these models.
For the last 40 years, ever since, it has really, as you show in your chart, it has just mushroomed. It truly has. Tax policy, every policy that you can imagine has gone the other direction. All the things that we did after World War II was just taken away. Unions are no longer effective, all these things. They're, in the last 40 years, they have been dismantled. They really have.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so I agree with that entirely. And that's all in the list of things that pop up that fit into one or both of those parameters.
The European, especially the Northern European countries, I've traveled over there, particularly to Denmark and Sweden and Norway. But the one thing that struck me when I was gone there, you see no homeless people, none. None. And they have high taxes, yes, and they have excellent education. And everybody has access to higher education, everybody.
Yes, yep.
I see Annette there, I think in Germany also.
Yes.
And so, those are major factors so far as wealth distribution. And they have progressive tax. We used to have progressive tax. Now we have regressive tax. We truly have regressive tax. Rich people pay no taxes in this country right now. Very little taxes.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, just in your comment about the higher taxes in those nations, they get universal health care and, like you say, college education. And if you throw that in, the advantage of their higher taxes is, or I should say, the advantage of the United States having lower taxes completely dissolves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, it's having spent a lot of time in those kind of countries, and also in Australia, New Zealand, and any of those countries, they have a much fairer tax system, and they all have access. Even our northern partner, Canada, every student in that country, no matter what province they live in, gets equal amount of money from the state for education. That's not true here.
Yeah.
Yes,
You
James.
made right at the beginning of this
Yeah.
of the talk, but I didn't really get the point of the data. So it kind of went over my head to a large extent. So I'm wondering if you could just back up and give us what is the main point you're trying to get across here, and what can we do about it? What are you suggesting that we can do in response to this?
Well, I think a concluding point is that we have a wealth bias parameter and a redistribution parameter, and we know what is included in both of those, and
That's too high level for me. Can you break those two terms down? I don't know what those parameters, what that means.
Okay, maybe we can
Wealth
put the
bias
slide.
and the other part. I don't know what that means. I really don't. So I just need to know what it means in layperson terms.
Well, it means that we have policies that are allowing the people who are already wealthy to have more advantages. And the wealth redistribution policies that we had in the past are being taken away. And so, not surprisingly, we're becoming more unequal. And these models show us in a quantitative, in a theoretical way, how that comes about. And they match the wealth distribution in all these different countries with astonishing precision.
Hey, Don,
I would say one more thing is that I believe a lot of this material, while it's quite valid and important for us to know, maybe over the average American's head. I was just looking at a statistic as you were talking, and 36% of Americans have college degrees. So the vast majority do not. And I would venture that of those 36%, probably only a portion of those are able to, can or will be interested or know how to interpret this type of information, this type of content. It's so sophisticated. So how do you make it accessible to people? And
I guess education is the
understand the
answer.
importance of it?
I guess education is the answer, not in terms of school, but somebody has to stand up and present this and say, look what's happening to you.
part of this,
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
well, this is Dave Rice. That's an ambiguous term here, but I'll take the floor. The term that happened around the 1980 term, those articulating the so-called trickle down theory of economics, sometimes called voodoo economics by others, seem to get an upper hand. And what your data broadly seems to say, no, it doesn't really trickle down, it trickles up. And it seems until the failure of it to trickle down, that is, and that means it inflicts enough pain that people will sort of buy a false argument, because clearly it isn't trickling down. That is the money, it's actually concentrating or trickling up.
Yes, and that's a key point. I'm glad you brought that up. Let me say it this way. Yes, the people feel the pain. At the same time, there's no other word for it, they are suckers to big government arguments that big government is bad. We need less government. We need to do away with regulations. And the things that they complain about there are exactly the things that are causing them the pain. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, that's like the book from Kansas. What is it?
What's the matter with Kansas?
Yeah, what's the matter with Kansas? And that's, they don't vote for their own welfare. That's a basic theme of the book.
Don?
Yes.
Is this a result or a cause, the great discrepancy between the salaries of the CEO and the average worker? Back in the 60s, it was maybe the CEO earned 50 times as much as the average worker. Now the CEO may earn 250 times as much as
more like 400 or 500.
or more.
Yeah.
So is this a result or a cause of this inequality?
Well, it's synergistic. It's all part of the same deal.
Yeah.
As the economy drifts toward oligarchy, the opportunity opens up for people of wealth to grab more of it. It's a feedback. It just goes out of control.
Yeah, Jane, let's have Jane in there.
Yeah, that Don's presentation made me think so much about the fact that I believe we are drifting toward oligarchy in our country. People with great wealth, corporations with great wealth, have an enormous amount to do with the decisions that are made at the federal and even the state level about how we will distribute money, how we will tax people. The latest figures I saw, I believe there's approximately 100 lobbyists for every one congressional member. So, you know, that's a ton of pressure. That's a lot of influence. And with the coming of the PACs, where you don't have to divulge who the donors are, the political PACs, you know, the people with the most wealth or corporations, and it's often more likely corporations actually, they provide the money for these tremendously expensive political campaigns. You know, now many people to run for Congress have to be able to spend millions. And so money rules. And the more this happens, the worse things get, the less the average person has influence or control over the decisions that are made, in my opinion. At least this is the way it appears to be.
Yes, thank you. Your opinion fits precisely into the model and the discussion that these modelists are talking about in the economy. Fits in perfectly. After a while, as soon as when you have a situation of equal trade or fair coin flippers, as soon as somebody comes out a little bit of ahead there, the probability that they will come out further ahead is increased. There's no force to pull it back to the normal. It goes away from the normal.
Yeah.
And so everything, it's all, if you want to look at it, it's just a form of corruption that's legal.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
If I could just
Anybody, go
comment
ahead,
on
Tom.
Jack's question about corporate remuneration. These large corporations typically have executive compensation committees that are formed by, you know, a subset of the directors. And they will typically look at the competitive landscape and basically what other executives in, I guess, similar jobs are doing. And the salaries ended up being ratcheted up less because of merit, but because some other guy at some other roughly equivalent company got a big pay increase, and it just keeps going up and up and up. It's, in my opinion, it's absolutely ridiculous and rather disgusting.
Well, they're basically all scratching each other's backs.
Yeah, they are.
And the same thing is happening in healthcare too. That the charges that you get are based on what everybody else is getting. There's no free competition in healthcare.
No, I mean, you get sick, you go to the hospital, you have no choice. Especially in this country. Tom, you had a comment. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to jump on Jane's comment. And many of us have been watching the impeachment trial, and it didn't take long after the announcement of the verdict for the analysts to start talking about the effects of the decision on corporate donations to candidates in future elections, as if those corporate donations are going to determine who's going to win all the races that are coming up. So yeah, it's just that PAC thing and that big money has just become such a big issue related to our democracy, and
Yeah,
it's huge.
I think the Georgia, I'm not sure I'm speaking.
yeah, go ahead,
But the
John.
Georgia election results are really optimistic because it shows that you can win elections while spending less money if you know what you're doing.
Is a good point.
Okay, the other thing I wanted to mention, well, two more things. One is that Ronald Reagan became president not because he told people what how he was going to benefit them, but he won based on his charisma and wrote laws to enrich individuals through the tax code. rich people can avoid paying taxes in a rather easy way. You can read some books by David K. Johnson about how the tax code has been rewritten to favor the wealthy. The third point I have been thinking about a while is that the stock market, which is a source of the income for these CEOs, they make enormous salaries because the company doesn't actually take money out of their operating budget. They take it out of the stocks. And the stock market is nothing but a savings account guaranteed by this government for the wealthy. That's it. When the government is making decisions about the distribution of money, they distribute it in a way that it goes to the stock market. And the stock market is dependent on government decisions for the money. You know, no company is worth $1 billion. You know, it isn't, but the government allows it to be worth that by supporting the stock market through the redistribution of money.
Well, keeping the interest rates low is one way to do that, but also another aspect is that over 80% of all the stock market is owned by the top 10%. Over 80%.
That's, you know, that's their bank account.
Yep. Anybody else? Comment, questions?
Yes, I have a comment.
Go ahead.
Some of the healthcare for all and higher education, whenever these are introduced, and this goes back to my high school days, that's socialism. You're promoting socialism, and that has stuck. And in this last election, the Republicans, particularly in Florida and other places, labeled the candidates socialist, and the socialists lost the election. All they were trying to do was do something good for the people.
Yeah, well, they compared to Venezuela and Cuba and former Soviet Union immediately, and that's not what socialism is. And us Democrats have done a lousy job of defining socialism.
Yeah, it's a buzzword.
It's a buzzword.
Maybe the Democrats should start using the word oligarchy.
I agree, but no, it's a buzzword. Please go ahead, Steele, David.
No, I was just going to say that, I mean, I agree with Jane. I think that we're well on the road to, you know, being an oligarchic society as well as an autocratic one. It's really discouraging. I have absolutely no idea. If I'm feeling very impotent as to how I, as an individual agent, can have any kind of an influence on anything that will make any difference whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, I want to follow up on Jane's comment. Having been in Washington for 25 years, her comment in regard to you know lobbyists and so forth, and the combination of them with the money that they have, and the extent to which politicians have to pay attention to them, it is very hard to change the system with that kind of advantage. You know, with lobbyists with money that have access. You know that any senator, that ex-senator, our ex-congressman has a right to go on the floor. Most people don't know that. When the Congress is voting on a serious piece of legislation, former congressmen can go on the floor and actually talk to current congressmen. Most people don't know that. I've seen it with my own eyes. And that's why ex-senators and ex-congressmen become highly paid lobbyists, because they can go on the floor.
Yeah, they know how to.
And you know, I don't know what state laws. All I know is what happened. I was there for 24 years and I saw it. And so how you know, it's pretty tough. How can an individual have an impact when with that kind of force? Go ahead. Anyone else?
Can we get Don's Gmail Before you leave, Don, could we get your Gmail again, your email address?
Yeah,
Oh.
Sarah, can you put that up?
Yeah, let me pull that up for you. So I have that here.
While she's pulling it up, there's somebody, I think it's John wants to say something. Maybe we could go ahead and,
Go ahead, John.
yeah.
Did you want to say something, John?
Well, this
No,
is,
no. Uh-oh.
is there anything in the model that would say,
Oh.
like back in 1929, the market is going to crash? Because is there anything economically that's a self-limiter other than a bunch of people taking over the Capitol building with machine guns or something?
My impression is that there's nothing in the model that could ever put anything like a revolutionary event or the burst of a bubble or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think there's anything like that in these models.
Okay, thank you.
Don, can I ask you, when you talked about toward the beginning, you talked about economics, and this, you had an adjective for this kind of economics, and I've forgotten that adjective.
You mean the name of the models?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
It's an agent-based. It's an agent-based model.
But it's within a field of economics that you had an adjective, and I don't remember what it was.
I think oligarchy you used, didn't you, Don?
Yeah.
Oligarchy?
Oh, well, I think you're probably talking about the affine.
Yeah.
AFFINE.
Right.
And a fine model, I should probably just say what that means. It refers to the mathematical form of the models, and it has to do with how transformations are being done, whether they're multiplicative in scale or translational or both combined. And it really probably doesn't help us understand anything about how the model works.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we have about 2 minutes left. Is there any additional comments anyone wants to make before we wrap up for today?
Yeah, anyone, please? When we get done here, I'll talk about what's going to happen next week.
Well,
Go
hey,
ahead.
this is Brooks.
Oh, Brooks, yeah, go ahead.
And I'm an old rocker, so I'm thinking about Aerosmith. And I'm thinking about a great song that they have. It says, "Eat the rich. There's only one thing that they're good for. Fill up with ones and spit out the rest." So I think that's an answer, perhaps.
Yeah, Jane, you had something you wanted to say.
I did just want to respond to John, who always has so many good points. He said that this last election proved that you could win the election with less money if you do the right things. And that's very hopeful. It did mean that, Biden still had to have many millions. I mean, he couldn't have done it with a very, very small amount of money, but he did it with less money. And, I do think that with the right kind of citizen engagement, that it's helpful to begin to elect people who have, maybe the knowledge and the stamina to begin to counteract some of these negative tendencies that are helping us drift further and further toward oligarchy.
So let's give Don a big hand, everybody. Come on. Thank you, Don. It's been a pleasure. What happened here?
Thank you.
Yeah. But anyway, next week, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, somehow I got cut off on my end. Next week, we're going to have Dinko. This is somebody, Charlie, maybe you can discuss, you came up with his name. He's from Department of Geography at Denver, University of Denver.
Yeah, just very quick. Yeah, his name is Dinko, and he's going to be having a very interesting talk about Ghana and how their society operates compared with ours. We think we got some problems, and Ghana seems to be a very good nation, but there's some problems there too. I think it'll be very interesting.
Yeah. Well, anyway,
Sounds good.
it'll be an interesting discussion, and we had a very good one today. So thank you very much, Don.
You're welcome.
Thank you,
All right.
Dawn. All right, thank you
so much.
everybody for joining. I hope you have a great afternoon and happy Valentine's Day.
Go out snow skiing.
Also, all right, bye everyone.
Bye.